Good afternoon, welcome. You are tuned into the Labor Forum here on WRFG, and it was our catchy song that started off by John Fromer. And of course, we receive some underwriting. It's called underwriting. So we bring you a message from the Teamsters Union, which has been a long time supporter of the Labor Forum ever since Gary Washington started this program back in 1986. My name is Diane Mathowitz, and I've been the co-host of this program for a couple years now, trying to follow in the footsteps of Gary Washington. I want to welcome Paul McLennan from the ATU, that's the Transit Workers Union. Hey, Paul.
Good afternoon.
And we have with us today as well Tamieka Atkins, who's with the National Domestic Workers Alliance chapter here in Atlanta. Hi, Tamieka.
Hi, Diane.
So we're excited about this program. Here we are in November, the first program in November. We have just concluded the 3-month fall fund drive here at WRFG, in which we for 3 weeks, every program has asked you, the listener of that program, to contribute financially to the success of the station and the ability for us to stay on air. As you know, this is a non-commercial radio station. All of our people on air are volunteers. We have just 2 paid staff, yet we still have tens and tens of thousands of dollars worth of expenses to be able to operate a 24-hour a day, 365-day a year radio station. It means that we have tower rent, office rent, lots of utilities, and as I said, just 2 salaries. And everything here is done most efficiently possible as we can do it, but it does mean that we are always in need of your financial support. And even though the fund drive is officially over, as we always say, your donation anytime, any day, any amount is always appreciated. So the opinions that are expressed on this program, though, may not necessarily be those of the Board of Directors, staff, or volunteers here at WRFG. But I always say that the Labor Forum goes to the core of why this station exists, in that it is to provide information, to provide music that is not dominated and controlled by corporate media, those who exploit and oppress not just the vast majority of the people in this country, but the people around the world. And WRFG brings the cultures, the music, the information, the analysis of those who are impacted by these anti-people policies to you, our listeners. And of course, we know that you can be listening on a radio, you can be listening on your computer, you can be listening on your mobile device. And for those fortunate folks who are watching us right now on the Labor Forum YouTube channel, you see our smiling faces as we get ready to do this program today. So we have instituted 2 segments that we start each Labor Forum program off, and the first one is Labor Headlines, and the second is a feature on this week in labor history, and then we will get into our interview with Tamieka, who is waiting patiently. So here we go with the labor headlines for Monday, November 3rd, 2014. But before I begin with the news of today, I want to bring your attention that today is the 35th anniversary of what is known as the Greensboro Massacre, when 5 anti-racist activists, union organizers, and medical doctors, members of the Communist Workers' Party, were murdered in broad daylight at an anti-Klan rally being held in a Greensboro housing project. Klansmen and Nazis drove up, pulled their guns out of the car trunks, and fired into the crowd, killing 4 men and 1 woman, and wounding 9 others. Despite the entire murderous spree captured on TV news cameras, all white juries found the killers not guilty. In 1985, a civil trial found the Greensboro police, the Klan, and Nazis guilty of wrongful deaths, resulting in a $350,000 judgment. But no jail time was ever served by any of the parties. This despicable crime and the failure of any justice being rendered, not just to the families of the victims, but for all opponents of racism, brings me to the international news item I'd like to share. Yesterday, November 2nd, marked 6 months since a horrific massacre took place in Odessa, Ukraine. Following the coup against the democratically elected president of Ukraine earlier in the spring, on May 2nd, neo-Nazi gangs who supported the U.S.-backed regime who supported the U.S.-backed regime change, attacked an Occupy-style protest encampment at Kulakova Field in the port city of Odessa, setting the tents on fire. The students and workers fled to the nearby House of Trade Unions. The right-wingers then set fire to the building and shot at people when they gathered at the windows seeking to escape the flames. Many of those who managed to get out were then beaten to death by the fascists. Bodies found inside the building had multiple gunshot wounds to the head, fired at point-blank range. Although this massacre, like Greensboro, was videotaped and many of the attackers are clearly identifiable, none have been brought to justice by the pro-U.S. government now in power in Kiev. The number of dead ranges from 48 to over 60 to hundreds. Yesterday, in cities around the world, including New York City, protests and rallies were held to denounce these murders and to demand justice. So from Greensboro to Odessa, the struggle continues. And lastly, a piece of good news. Zanny Jackson, a Lithia Springs homeowner facing foreclosure, has won 2 significant victories in recent weeks. Some of you might remember Zanny's story when he came on the Labor Forum some months ago. In 2012, Zanny, the father of a young son, was diagnosed with renal failure and had to endure hours of dialysis several times a week to stay alive. Despite his good credit history with his mortgage company before becoming so ill, he was given no break from Fannie Mae, Bank of America, and Ceterius Corporation, all of whom had power over his home. With the help of Occupy Our Homes Atlanta, who organized rallies, online petitions, and numerous other actions that shamed these profit-making entities who were willing to throw a hardworking but dangerously ill man and his child out on the streets, Zanny now has victory. On October 31st, Zanny successfully reached an agreement that modifies his home loan to a monthly payment he can afford. And just weeks before that piece of good news, Zanny underwent a successful kidney transplant and is recovering in his own home. The Labor Forum sends out congratulations to Zanny and all those who stood with him and his son. We repeat the slogan of Occupy Our Homes to all of our listeners. When we fight, we win. And that concludes our labor headlines for today, and we're going to move right into Paul and his history segment here on the Labor Forum.
Okay, thanks, Diane. This week marks the anniversary of the New Orleans General Strike, which began on November 8th, 1892. 30 years after the end of the Civil War, and with the betrayal of the promise of Reconstruction, black and white workers united to walk out for joint demands. One historian called it the first general strike in American history to enlist both skilled and unskilled labor, black and white, and to paralyze the life of a great city. There were general strikes in America before 1892, but none included black workers. This one involved 25,000 workers, half the city's workforce, who together with their families represented a great deal of the city's population. It lasted 4 days. The 1880s had been marked by several integrated labor strikes and demonstrations, but stirrings of the general strike originated in May 1892 when a successful walkout by streetcar operators won recognition for a closed shop and shorter hours, from 16 to 12 hours per day. Local labor unity was enhanced throughout the year as the American Federation of Labor's organizing campaign added 30 new unions to the previous 65. African American labor organizer George Norton was mostly responsible for the AFL's success in chartering biracial unions. The unions established a Central Labor Council known as the Working Men's Amalgamated Council that represented more than 20,000 workers. 3 racially integrated unions, the Teamsters, the Scalesmen, and the Packers, made up what came to be called the Triple Alliance. Many of the workers belonging to the unions of the Triple Alliance were African American. Each of the 49 unions on strike demanded union recognition and a closed shop. "Tie the town up" was the workers' battle cry, and for several days they did. The strike hit just as the commercial season began. The delivery of food and beverages ceased, streetcars stopped running, construction, printing, street cleaning, and even the firefighting services ground to a halt. Electrical and gas workers walked out, plunging the city into darkness at night. Manufacturing stopped. The Board of Trade, representing financial and commercial interests in the city, appointed a committee to make decisions for the employers. It announced that it would sign an agreement with the scalesmen and the packers unions, but not with the Teamsters, whose membership was predominantly African American. To sign an agreement with the Triple Alliance, including the Teamsters, the Board of Trade asserted, would be to place the employers under the control of African Americans. The bigotry of the Board of Trade was matched by the New Orleans newspapers. Employers utilized race-based appeals to try to divide the workers and turn the public against the strikers. To their credit, the workers of the Triple Alliance stayed united, despite the attempts to split them along color lines. The scalesmen and packers publicly declared that they would never return to work until the employers signed up with all three members of the Triple Alliance. The members of other unions in New Orleans began to call for a general strike in support of the Triple Alliance. Pro-labor Mayor John Fitzpatrick refused the business community's calls to intervene to end the strike, so Louisiana Governor Murphy Foster assumed control of the city on November 10th. He placed several battalions of the state militia on alert. Despite the fact that the strikers had been peaceful and orderly, Foster issued a proclamation ordering citizens not to congregate in crowds. The proclamation implied that the militia would be called out if the strike continued. Foster's edict amounted to a declaration of martial law and warned labor of possible bloodshed ahead. To finally settle the strike, the Board of Trade agreed to binding arbitration. Although they refused at first, the employers agreed to sit down with both white and black union leaders. After 48 hours of negotiations, the employers agreed to the 10-hour day and overtime pay, but not the closed union shop, nor would they grant recognition to the unions of the Triple Alliance. Other unions also won reduced hours and higher pay. The general strike in New Orleans in 1892 came at the end of a remarkable year that saw strikes by steel workers in Homestead, Pennsylvania, train switchmen in Buffalo, New York, coal miners in East Tennessee, and silver miners in Coeur d'Alene, Idaho. Within a year, the Panic of 1893 would mark the beginning of the 19th century's worst economic crisis, producing high unemployment and deep wage cuts for African Americans and whites alike. The solidarity across color lines displayed in 1892 was soon replaced by bitter hostility as wages plunged and many white dock workers in New Orleans fought to deny African American workers access to the few good jobs available.
Thank you, Paul. Well, so now we've both had our look at recent events and we've had our look at past events, and now we're going to talk about what's happening right now with Tamieka Atkins. So again, Tameka's been on this program before, and we're really happy that she's here, and we're hoping that she's going to come back often. And she is with the Domestic Workers Alliance chapter here in Atlanta, and has been super engaged in the struggle of low-wage workers, and really that's kind of what we want to talk about right now. We've had all kinds of low-wage workers on this program because they, in fact, are the ones who are really shaking up and fighting back against all the cuts and the low wages and the lack of benefits and everything else that plagues really most workers in this country. So Tamieka, again, welcome to the Labor Forum, and can you just give us a little update about what the National Domestic Workers Alliance is and what it's doing, and what other kinds of activities your organization is involved in with some of these other workers who are on the move, which includes fast food workers and home health care workers. Big question, but go ahead.
Thanks, Diane. So the National Domestic Workers Alliance is an organization made up of 43 other organizations and also us here in Atlanta, their first chapter. And we're organizing nannies, housekeepers, and home care workers, collectively identified as domestic workers, to improve the working conditions and the benefits and the treatment and dignity for the entire sector. A sector that is 95% women, a sector that has historically been excluded from both the National Labor Relations Act and the Federal Labor Standards Act. And what that means is that it is a sector that is primarily identifiable as low-wage workers.
I know that we've seen some numbers about how many tens and tens and tens of thousands of people work in fast food. We've seen the statistics about their age and their backgrounds and, whether they're men or women and all this kind of demographic information. And now there's been some of the home health care workers were on our show a couple of weeks ago, and they provided some of that information as well. But in Atlanta or in Metro Atlanta, do you have any figures about how many people work as domestic workers?
So I can say that in Atlanta, Metro Atlanta, there's an estimated 12,000 domestic workers. And I say estimated because the Department of Labor actually doesn't track this particular sector of work. And so we, as an alliance, we actually did a survey project across the country to begin gathering some of the same data that you're referencing.
Mm-hmm. So it seems to me that one of the main things we're talking about here is that a lot of people probably, maybe, work through agencies. And then a lot of others are independently contracted through newspaper ads or online or word of mouth or something like that. And so they're not eligible for unemployment, I take it. And so do you have any idea about the figures, again, of what would be perhaps an annual salary of a domestic worker here in Metro Atlanta? Also, if you have any information about how many have to have food stamps or require other sources of assistance just to get by.
So here in Atlanta, for domestic workers, the average wages, they vary anywhere from maybe about $8 to $8.65 an hour to $15 an hour. And just to add to this, that could mean you're taking care of one client or you're taking care of 3 or 4 clients. And that is not often factored into the wages.
So what is the kind of work we're talking about? I mean, you mentioned nannies and you mentioned home health care workers. And I'm assuming this means everything from people who live, does this include people who live in as well? Or are we talking about people who come for work 8, 10, 12 hours a day?
So it includes both, but what we've seen so far in Atlanta is that a majority of the workers are not live-in. They come for anywhere from 8 to 10 to 12 hours a day.
All right, so one of the things we talked about before we had came on air was about the noticeable alliance that's coming to bear among low-wage workers. So we've seen at some of the fast food demonstrations or the home health care demonstrations or domestic work that we see workers from all of these low-wage areas coming out in support. And I want to just add sort of on another field, we saw last week a rally that took place between the MARTA workers, the ATU members who are fighting for a decent contract from MARTA, with the Atlanta Symphony Orchestra members who have been locked out now. I believe it's going on almost 9 weeks, if not 10, by the Woodruff Art Center folks. So it seems as though, or I find this really encouraging, especially since we've had many of the folks on the air here, that what we always try to do is encourage people to stand together. So maybe you could talk a little bit about these developments among low-wage workers.
So what we saw happening, like you said, is that we'd see these, we'd have these different events and opportunities to do work around low-wage worker issues like minimum wage, access to health care, paid sick days, and we were seeing that there was an overlap in our membership, in our base, in the community, in the population that we were organizing. And so we realized, what would it look like for so many of our groups to work together, right, in a strategic way. And what's the outcome of that is, through Atlanta Jobs with Justice, we've actually formed a low-wage worker table. And the first action that we took was a town hall led by workers, with workers on the panel from all walks of work, from union workers to fast food workers to domestic workers, questioning folks running for office right now in the midterm elections about issues that are near and dear to their heart. Mm-hmm. And that was actually our first action, our first collective action, and we're looking forward to really pushing what is a low-wage worker agenda. One that all of our organizations can be a part of and lift up. And I just want to go back to when we talk about some of the statistics. 2/3 of people of the folks earning minimum wage in this country are women. Many times heads of household, right? So when you talk about low-wage workers, and you're also talking about women workers, right, and the difficulty in providing for their families, this is real. I also want to add that for home care workers, more than half of them rely on some sort of public assistance in order to support their families.
I might add, they probably also rely on public transportation.
Absolutely.
And so that again brings all these issues that we've had here. We've had lots of discussions about public transportation, about the possibility of people in Clayton County actually having access to buses and other forms of public transportation, so they'd actually be able to get to jobs and get to school and get to doctor appointments and go to the grocery store and all the rest without having to either walk for miles in all kinds of weather or take a cab, which is probably wipes out whatever they were going to earn if they have to take it to their job. So let me just ask one more question. You asked, you mentioned this, so there was this forum. Is there a next plan, or will you tell us about that the next time you come on air?
I actually will be telling you about that the next time I come on air. But we are working on and developing our plans for 2015, and they're really exciting. And again, I think what is significant about this work is that this is a worker-led movement. And so we're really excited about the opportunities that we can take advantage of collectively in 2015.
I'll just say one more time, I know Paul has a question, that every low-wage worker, whether it's fast food, airport workers, the home health care workers, the domestic workers who have come on this program have been articulate, have been totally grounded in the issues, and so I would say yes, you've really, if those workers are part of this board, you've really got a dynamite team. Did you have a question, Paul?
Tamieka, I was wondering about the home care workers in particular, and one of the communities that I've gotten to know through the work around transit is the disability community, because they're dependent on MARTA to get around. And from their side, as consumers of a public service, it's led the union to see the strategic importance of working together with the people that they serve. And I'm wondering if you see potential there for home care workers and the disability community that they may serve.
So absolutely. I know that nationally, when we've organized home care workers, so we have a recent win. We won, the Federal Department of Labor has changed their classification for home care workers. And what that means practically is that in 29 states, including Georgia, home care workers are now eligible for minimum wage and overtime, where they were not before. And these new regulations they're being implemented as of January 1st, 2015. That has changed somewhat, right? Now we're looking at a 6 month to a year delay where they are implemented, but what we were seeing, NDWA and the DOL, the Department of Labor, was although agencies had 15 months to figure out how they would implement the regulations, what we saw were really quick and hasty preparations being made, where the most concrete example is that workers were being capped at 40 hours a week so that they would not receive overtime. What that means, particularly for the disability community, is that they're not getting the service, the length of service that they need. And so, what we've been working on nationally, and what I see us doing here in Georgia in 2015, is what does it look like for us to have both the consumers and the workers actually partner together in shaping the future of care. And there is a way for us to provide good and support a highly functional care system while still making sure that workers are being fairly compensated and they don't have to worry about being unable to pay for their basic necessities because of low wages. There is a middle ground there, and it's going to require us to partner together, and it is doable.
And the biggest concern that I've heard from the community side, from the consumer side, is of the problem with turnover. And if people are being paid what they should be getting paid, you're going to have a more stable workforce. And I've learned so much from how these relationships get built, because this is a very intimate relationship that home care workers have with dealing with a lot of these health issues. So you want to have someone you know and trust, and for that worker to be compensated.
Yes, thank you.
Maybe we can go into this a little bit more now in the kind of historical and analytical perspective. So we've talked oftentimes on this program about the National Labor Relations Act, the National Labor Relations Board, and these were all entities and legislation that was passed during the Roosevelt years in a period of very heightened labor organizing. It's the period of time in which my union, the UAW, was formed through sit-down strikes. It's a period of time in which really tens and tens and tens of thousands of workers joined unions. And so the government was really forced to, I would say, regulate the relationship between workers and their employers. But at that time, and we've talked about this before, Paul has done a historical segment on this, the National Labor Relations Act excluded several sectors of work which predominantly employed both black men and women, and that included farm workers, it included domestic workers. And this was done largely because of the strength of segregationist members of Congress who essentially were not going to allow the act to be passed unless these concessions were made so that the workforce in the largely rural and highly Jim Crow South was able to be maintained. So, can we have a conversation now for a little bit about how it is and why it is we think that this law, which has been in place for over 70 years, is now is this the first time there's been a change where workers that had been excluded are included? Does anybody know? I don't think farm workers are still included.
So I know farm workers are still not included, and I know that domestic workers are still not included. What we've been doing as an alliance is actually going state by state to get legislation passed that would include domestic workers in the labor protections that other workers have. And we now have one domestic worker bill of rights in 4 states. And we are engaging in campaigns to get this type of legislation passed in 2 other states in 2015.
Okay, so maybe I'm confused here. The ruling that you just said, that didn't actually include domestic workers into the act, it just changed 2 items of overtime, and I'm confused. Can you explain it all for me?
I can include it, I explain it a little bit better. So what it is that home care workers, which includes, when we say home care workers, we're talking about home health aides, private care aides, CNAs, and those workers.
Oh, but not nannies.
But not nannies and not
maids,
housekeepers.
not cooks.
But those workers, more often than not, were incorrectly classified. And this is, as a union person, they were classified as companions. Companions are workers who sit next to someone and they essentially provide companionship. They sit. And so they are equated to almost babysitters. And so because
Anybody who's been a babysitter knows you don't sit.
but because of that, under the title of companions, that meant that workers were excluded from as home care workers were excluded from these other minimum wage and overtime. With the reclassification, so that's really where the shift is that, well, how do we establish who's a home care worker and is doing a lot of work in terms of providing care, support, assistance, development, and love, right, to their clients. How do we checklist that and say, okay, you are a home care worker, therefore you are now included in minimum wage and overtime protections, and that's what we want, is a reclassification.
Okay, so to clarify this for me then, there actually was no change then in the NLRA's exclusions.
That's correct.
Okay.
That is correct.
So this fight still goes on.
It goes on, and it's still going on also for the larger sector for nannies and housekeepers, where we are literally working and struggling state by state to get workers included in their state's labor protections.
Okay, so do either of you, Paula or Tamieka, because I don't know, have you ever heard that there's been any move in Congress to change the NLRA to include this? So this is sort of like a frozen law. The exclusions of sectors that included mostly workers of color, and certainly now farm workers are quite often immigrants, Spanish-speaking, Asian workers. That's still, there's just like no movement on that at all. And so I think one of the reasons I'm excited for you to be on the program is we do talk a lot here about the rights of people when they can belong to a union. But I think the other thing that's very clear is that there's other forms of worker organizing that isn't strictly the kind of union language or union structure that we may be familiar with. And so that's why I think the efforts that have been made by the fast food workers, the home health care workers, and the farm workers, because we've had the Coalition of Immokalee Workers on a lot as well, show the way that wherever workers are, they have a vehicle to fight for their rights.
Yes.
So do you want to talk a little bit more about how that actually works with something like the Domestic Workers Alliance? Because I think a lot of people who are in either small workplaces or individual homes, that it's kind of very hard to figure out how to join together. I came out of auto, thousands of workers there, we all were together, day in and day out. We all knew that if we all didn't do our job, the car didn't come off the end of the line. It was very clear to see that we were all tied together. So how does that work when you're dealing more, as I said, with perhaps somebody who's individually in a home?
We spend a lot of time in the streets in Atlanta. And so we do on the ground, person by person, outreach and recruitment. We are in the parks in Atlanta. We are outside of agencies in Atlanta. We are at the story times in the libraries in Atlanta, recruiting domestic workers one by one by one. And we started with a base of about 50-something workers, and we are now at a base of over 500 workers in 2 years. And this is just the beginning. We provide services for our workers. We have a health referral program. Over 64% of domestic workers do not have health insurance. And because of, again, the nature of the work, they more often than not do not get regular pay stubs, right? And so in order to access clinic services, one requirement is an identification requirement, and that that often means you need to show a pay stub. And so we formed a relationship with a clinic here in Georgia where our members are able to access the services that they provide through our own internal pay stub that the workers fill out. And so this has been a great recruitment tool for the chapter while also providing a much needed service for the domestic worker community.
I have a question about, do you have any idea what percent of the workers are independent contractors and what percent work for agencies?
That is a great question, Paul, and I do not know that off the top of my head. I know that we have a survey report that is super thick and will probably have that information in it. What I can say is that this work is so fluid, and so we see workers go from private pay, so where it's a referral, word of mouth, you meet a family in the park, your current family refers you to a new family. One worker has more work than she can take on, and so she gets a second worker to support her. So we see that, and then working directly for the agencies, contracted by the agencies. There's so much fluidity there. As a matter of fact, what we also see when we think about this as a larger care industry, we also see a lot of workers who are nannies and housekeepers and home care workers have also worked in daycares at some point, right? Like this is a super fluid, and that is it's such an interesting workplace where, you know, I can share one story. A worker was on probation for 3 months, and after that would have had access, because she is not excluded as a daycare worker, to overtime benefits, and she was told, without a particular reason, we want to extend your probation by 3 more months, which meant 3 more months that she didn't have health insurance. And the option was, I have protections, there's a vehicle for me to voice a complaint. The reality is that this worker with the high turnover would lose her job. And so in this particular situation, we're seeing a care worker who is not excluded and who has protections, but in actuality cannot implement those protections. So it's just a very fluid work base.
And I'm guessing, I've heard of a company called Acumen, and this has been a problem with a friend of mine who's trying to get the stability with the turnover. And I'm just going to guess, and tell me how this works, that when you're dealing with an agency, they're going to take their cut, and then by the time it gets to the worker, you're going to be paid that much less because the agency is going to get paid. They're in the middle. Is that right?
One of our member leaders, Shirley Murphy, she struck out on her own as a home care worker. And why she ended up striking out on her own is because she happened to see the contract between the employers and the agency. And where the agency was being paid $19 an hour for her service, Shirley was bringing home $8.65.
Yeah, that's what I was afraid of.
Okay, we will be right back. We're going to play a brief message. Here at WRFG, we have been in conversation with Tamieka Atkins with the National Domestic Workers Alliance, and Paul McLennan and myself, Diane Mathwitz. You are listening to the Labor Forum. After this message, we'll be back for a few more questions. Welcome back. You are tuned into the Labor Forum here on WRFG. Co-host Paul McLennan, myself, Diane Mathwitz, are in conversation with Tamieka Atkins of the National Domestic Workers Alliance chapter here in Atlanta. And we want to thank Tamieka for all this information. There are so many, tens of thousands of people here in the metro area who work hard every day, provide absolutely essential services that people expect to be able to have, and yet themselves are so pressed to be able to make just the bare minimum of paying rent and buying food and keeping their utilities on. And certainly the workers that Tamieka works with are among that group. And it's exciting. It's really exciting here on the Labor Forum to hear about the struggle that's taking place, and more than that, the achievements that's taken place by all kinds of workers, but certainly the ones that are the kind of most marginalized, where people don't think they have the capacity, I guess, to act on their own and to act in their own interests, and are just sort of at the whim of an employer. And so you brought us great news. Paul has another question, and we'll go ahead with that.
Thanks, Diane. A couple weeks ago, Tamieka, we had two members of the transit union, the President Curtis Howard, a mobility operator, and a paratransit rider. And we got into the conversation at one point, and what was exciting to hear was the dialogue between the operator and the paratransit consumer talk about how we know how to run this system better than they do, because we're the ones who are on the street every day trying to get people where they need to go. And on the other side, the riders know every sidewalk, every elevator, all the problems that they face, and that together, that pool of knowledge, the experts that were sitting at this table, it's exciting to me to think about partnerships. And when you said that this idea about the future of care, how could consumers and home care workers vision a new way to work together to provide service?
That's a great question, Paul. So the National Domestic Workers Alliance, seeing that there was a vacuum in this conversation about care, created a new organization called Caring Across Generations. And that is an organization that is focused totally on improving the future of care, improving the care sector, so that both the workers and the consumers are receiving adequate care while also being cared for themselves. And so in 2013, thousands of workers and consumers attended town halls across the country, which we called care councils. And really, that is the first documented time where there was this, not just this part, so one, it's significant because of the partnership piece, right? From the very beginning, this is a conversation that we need to be having together. But also, it was a space of visioning about what would a good care system look like to you. And folks were invigorated and inspired to be there with workers and with consumers, having this conversation and realizing this is a struggle that we are equally impacted by, you know.
If I could say, one of the things that was brought up when we had two home health care workers on the program a couple of weeks ago was that, of course, everybody, if they live long enough, faces the possibility at some time, perhaps, of needing a home health care worker. And so the discussion was about, here are home health care workers who are providing this service today, but their own personal future, that they wouldn't actually have the capacity if they in some way became sick or disabled, to be able to employ somebody like themselves, 10, 15 years down the line.
Some of our most active members around our Caring Across Generations campaign are home care workers who are recently retired and are going to fall into that gap where they now need care. And as the ones who recently provided care, they know just how difficult it's going to be to receive the care they need. Right now, we are living in a time where we have our baby boomers and they are aging rapidly, and
You have two
we're
of them
calling
right
it. We
next
have
to
two
you.
right now. I'm sandwiched in, and I am the sandwich generation, where I'm supporting both a parent and also a child. So I'm really sandwiched in two ways here. And it's being called the silver tsunami, right? And we're anticipating that we're going to need at least 50% more home care workers than we have right now by 2022. And if we don't improve the quality of the jobs, we're not going to be able to attract and retain the skilled, compassionate workers we need. Mm-hmm. And so Caring Across Generations is working at a federal level, lobbying and creating legislation that will make a pathway for both workers and consumers to end with a good and working care system. What would it look like to have a system of job development? You can work as a home care worker for 20 years and not see a change in your salary, right? And that means two things. One, it means that, again, workers are not being paid enough to do the work, right? What it also means is that as a consumer, how do you vet the best worker for you, right? This is a two-way street. And so what would it look like to be able to have job ladders where you can say, I can see the experience, right? That I can document and see the experience that this worker has, that there has been this ability to progress in the job, and I can see what it is I need and be clear about what I'm hiring and be happy about the worker that is supporting you, right? And at the same time, matching that job progression with salary progression, right? How do we, make these two things happen? And so, we have some states, like in Maine, who are organizing, they're organizing their state. And as the Atlanta chapter, we will be doing some organizing ourselves in 2015. What does it mean to do research in your state, right? That is specific to your state about what kind of care do we have now and how do we get to that future of care that we're talking about? What needs to shift in terms of funding? What do we want some long-term care insurance? Is that something that would work in the state of Georgia? But we need to have those conversations.
Let me just ask, so what would Medicaid expansion, if these folks in the Georgia Capitol had not squashed it, what would that have meant for home health care workers? Would it have had any impact?
Well, it would have had impact in terms of for our membership. So we know over 600,000 people in Georgia fall into the coverage gap, those who are not able to afford health insurance, right? Who would have been eligible for Medicaid if the expansion went through. Many of our workers fall into that gap, and these workers are home care workers, nannies, and housekeepers. And so again, it means that they're unable to access care for themselves. That is the biggest way that they're impacted. In terms of salaries or increased wages, really it was most of the expansion and the jobs for the expansion would have been more administrative, because the growth of the Medicaid program, the sheer number of people using the system, which, by the way, even without expanding Medicaid, we've seen the number of folks enrolled in Medicaid grow exponentially, simply because when you do access the Affordable Care Act online, you find out that you're qualified. And so we've denied funding for an inevitable growth. Funding that we're all paying for out of our tax dollars. And so I'm getting a little passionate because as a chapter of domestic workers, this is one of our campaigns. But primarily that these are workers who wouldn't have to choose between, like Miss Wendy choosing between her diabetes medication or paying for her car insurance.
Okay, so the 70,000 jobs that were referenced many times when this whole discussion about what Georgia is missing out on by the failure of Governor Deal and then the legislature to expand Medicaid, that, as you said, would have been more in the area of more nurses in hospitals, more administrators, more technicians, more whatever. But it would not have necessarily meant more home health care workers for people, because that's not covered by Medicaid?
It is covered by Medicaid, that just isn't where, the way the money is structured in terms of where the money is going, which I think is a conversation that we need to have.
All right. You've given us lots and lots of information, Tamieka. Are there some websites and telephone numbers for those out there listening who may fall in this kind of category of home health care workers, domestic workers, or surely there's everybody who knows somebody?
To find out more information about domestic workers and domestic worker organizing, you can go to www.domesticworkers.org. If you want to find out more about what we're doing specifically here in Atlanta, you can go to www.atlantadomesticworkers.org. And then if you're looking for more information about that future of care and how do we plan for long-term care and implement a new vision for the care economy in this country, you can go to www.caringacrossgenerations.org.
Thanks so much, Tamieka. We're really looking forward to you coming back quite often here on the Labor Forum. I know Paul has an announcement about an action that's taking place concerning, again, as we have said, the MARTA workers are struggling against a very recalcitrant management. And so you have an action to let us know about?
Well, just to connect the dots, the current general manager of MARTA, Keith Parker, when he was in San Antonio before he came here, he was part of a study that was done on paratransit. And the study showed that privatization is not a good idea because of the high turnover that is a consequence of lower wages when the private company takes over. So he comes to Atlanta, and now, on Thursday, a vote is going to be taken to privatize MARTA Mobility for the second time. And the first time in the 90s it didn't work, and now they're going to try it again. So the union is going to be out at the Lindbergh headquarters at 11 o'clock on Thursday morning. The actual vote will take place at the MARTA board meeting at 1:30. That's 2424 Piedmont, the MARTA Lindbergh headquarters.
So Paul, this is an open hearing, right?
Yes, a
People can
public
sign up to
comment.
speak?
It's one of those fill out a card and you have 2 minutes on the 6th floor of the MARTA building.
No doubt there are many people listening to this program who have an opinion about everything in regard to the low wages and frozen wages that the MARTA workers have suffered under, and all the reduction in routes and all the rest of it. And now certainly privatization of the mobility vans, which are the lifeline for so many people here in this city, since there's not enough public transit that's accessible, so people have to take these vans. So just one more time, the time and date and place.
11 o'clock on Thursday, November 6th at 2424 Piedmont, the MARTA Lindbergh headquarters, and the board meeting will start at 1:30. And you can come early to sign in if you want to speak at public comment.
And I've been to those meetings, and when they've been filled with workers and commuters and riders, and it can be a very exciting time. So with that, we'll say goodbye for today, and we look forward to you tuning in again next Monday, 4 to 5, here at WRFG 89.3 FM. And we are your Labor Forum team. Bye-bye.